Making the decisions that are shaping how companies impact the world. In each episode, we sit down with the thought leaders who are proving that building successful businesses and also building a better future don't have to be in conflict. I'm your host, Jeff Davis, co-founder of Circulins, which is one of the fastest growing digital product passport companies in the world. And our special guest today is Corey Peet, Vice President of Sustainability at Aqua Star. Welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And leadership today, it isn't just about performance, it's about responsibility too. So let's get into it. What would you say was like the very first, oh wow, I see a problem kind of moment, as far as environmental concerns?
For me, I grew up in British Columbia. When I went to university to study conservation ecology, at the same time, there was the salmon farming industry was developing in the British Columbia fjords. There was all sorts of controversy about it. My ecology professors were saying, exotic species or introduced species are the second leading cause of species extinction. And here we were farming Atlantic salmon in our backyards in the Pacific Ocean. And so it never really made sense to me. And that's really the moment where I decided that I would take on that task of understanding the issue better as part of my education. And it kind of launched me into the world of sustainable seafood very much by accident.
Yeah, but all the way back to when you were a student, there was something about it that resonated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know. I grew up in British Columbia, and as a kid, I just was immersed in incredible nature all the time. So any threats to that didn't really sit well with me, if I'm being
Yeah.
honest. So,
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
What's been like one of the more surprising things that you've learned, on the journey as far as like going green in a big company?
For me, the journey has been one where, it's easy to come to the green sustainability space with a lot of ideas of what you think sustainability is. And
Right?
it's much harder to actually get to that nexus point between business and implementation that actually works. And of
Right.
course, the biggest thing I've learned is that when I started, my definition of sustainability was just about the environment. But today, it's about the environment, it's about human rights due diligence, it's about women's equality, climate change, animal welfare, traceability, blah, blah, blah. And if you can tell me what the definition of sustainability is with all of that, I'd probably call you a liar. So that's the challenge, is how do we balance all of those variables into that equation that actually works for business? So
And how do you do
I knew you were going to ask that. I
that?
think you have to do it step by step, right? You have to realize that, seafood supply chains are not actually supply chains, they're supply webs. And when they're webs, that makes it a lot harder to try to figure out how do you put controls on each node on those various issues. So it's certainly not something that we can do on our own. We absolutely have to rely on industry collaborations and collaborations with other actors and stakeholders that can help us do all of that. And it doesn't go as fast as I'd like, but that's what happens. And I think the other piece that's really important to understand is that, as a North American, I have the privilege to think about what sustainability means. Not everyone else in the world has that same privilege. And so it's very important to not impose my view of sustainability on the places where we work. Rather,
Mm,
it's important to go and listen, bring your ideas, but make sure you ground them with the people that they affect the most. Because if you
ah.
don't, then you're forcing sustainability rather than fostering it. And that's not going to
Right,
get us
when
anywhere.
right, and there's all kinds of other factors that it's like you don't even know what you don't know sometimes until you
Exactly.
up to that.
But to be very clear, I was, the 6'3" white guy from Canada that took a shrimp standard to Thailand that these shrimp farmers had had no say in creating, and saying, this is going to be really good for you guys. And it's like, oh boy, very embarrassing 20 years later to think that that's what I actually did. But I did.
No, I actually lived in Thailand for a couple of years and I looked out at the water and at night I could see all the boats out there every night. Was there anything on your journey that almost made you quit? Or it's like a frustration, you get to roadblocks, you get to the obstacles.
Yeah, I'm such a nerd about all this stuff that I don't really think that's been true. Although, I definitely have had my moments where I'm like, wow, am I doing anything that matters, or am I just good at convincing people to give me money to try things? Because I had my own company for a while with my wife, Laura, and we had a lot of opportunities to work with chefs and small producers. So no, I don't think I've ever quit, but I've definitely been discouraged.
I mean, you started with the path on this, I think, earlier than a lot of people do, even from the time you were a student. And I know some of the conversations people were thinking about sustainability in terms of like the PR aspect of it. And I'm always curious if there was a point when you realized it wasn't just makes the company look good that you care. It was really more about survival or the impact.
Survival of the company, or I mean, the way I tend to look at it is it's about survival of our species. That's what people
Right,
don't want to consider, right? Is that
right.
no, this isn't about saving the planet. The planet's going to be fine as long as, we could take three-quarters of it with us and it'll still be fine. It's about us. And how do we live sustainably on this planet? So is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. What's the hardest trade-off that you've had to make between like the profit side of things and the planet side of things?
I think that the hardest trade-off is just understanding that you can't change it all tomorrow in the way that you want to change it to. That there's this process of understanding the depth of the problem and understanding you're trying to integrate something that has never been integrated into a business that's been very successful for 40 years, right? That doesn't come easily. And so it's not about just like integrating and grounding on the company side, it's about integrating and grounding at the bottom of the supply chain and every step in between. So a huge part is trying to explain like why should a farmer care about a critically endangered species, or because in some cases they're sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're near the poverty line, and you're asking them to care about a critically endangered species when in some cases they're just trying to make ends meet. So education is critical, but not saying like this is, Corey's ultimate definition of sustainability and you need to understand this now. No, it's like, what's the bite-sized chunk that I can explain and get buy-in and get improvement on so that there's a learning and growing and a journey that starts to happen that then we can build upon. So I think that's the biggest challenge is how do you do that in every single step of the chain, which I said isn't a chain, it's actually a web, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
that's the tough part.
What would you say is like the financial risk of not really fully going green that a lot of CEOs might be ignoring?
I'm not sure I could speak to the financial risk other than, as a US company, there's always the threat of litigation for claims. But I think the sustainability space is really about making sure that you have answers, right? If you're going to say your product's sustainable, which we don't, then you better be able to define how it's sustainable and have data to back that up. Right? I mean, I think in the sustainable seafood space, the whole movement has been characterized by partnerships between larger companies and NGO partners who then do work with the company, but they're also used as cover. But I think that as we move forward, it's really going to be data that drives the credibility narrative more than the NGO partners because we're heading into a space, we're not there quite yet, where there's no excuse to not have data on these key issues that you're working on, right? Because we're in a technological revolution, AI is coming,
Yep,
and a big focus for me right now is trying to make sure that we have the data streams that ultimately AI will chew on and making
yep.
sure that those are really solid data streams so that we're not getting, I don't
Oh
want to
yeah,
say we're
absolutely.
well down that road, like we're still just in the process of doing all that.
And in places like the European Union are mandating it so that,
Yep.
it's not even an option to have more data on those little touch points in the process from where the thing was made, when it was made, to the final destination. And I guess as far as circular, like even beyond that final destinations, and salmon's a different thing than electronics.
Yep.
But yeah, that's like digital product passports. It's all about like more data and leveraging AI. What legacy do you want to leave with the role that you're in?
Legacy, I don't necessarily worry about that, except my goal is to make a difference. That's always been my goal is, can we make things better? Can we make the world better? Can we actually make a difference? I've been at this for 25 years. I'm not super sure that I've made a difference, but I've certainly tried.
Come on.
It's complicated, but I do think that the difference that matters to me is that fostering of the understanding of sustainability, right? And how much have we done that, especially on the ground? I had an opportunity before I worked full time for a company to actually work with stakeholders on the ground in Southeast Asia and foster conversation amongst them about sustainability. And it kind of blew my mind as to how much they cared and how much they wanted their own say, which again is very embarrassing to say aloud, but it's what was true, right? And so the legacy that matters to me is how much have we really listened to especially the bottom end of the supply chains where most of the impact can happen, and where, of course, there isn't inequality between what we do here and what the realities and opportunities and resources that developing countries have over there. So that's what matters to me is how much do we listen? How much can we foster that understanding? How much can we improve over time?
And with kind of piggybacking off of that, is there a certain metric that's like the your most important metric that you
The
track?
metric that is currently tracked today, which is still pretty rudimentary, is just whether or not I would call it a metric of engagement on sustainability. So, is it certified? Is it in what's called an improvement project? But I think where the sustainable seafood movement started, it started with just a handful of opportunities for certification. And now there's more and more coming online, which on the one hand, yes, you could argue creates confusion for the consumer, but on the other hand, it creates competition at the bottom and better models for certification, which is what's needed. So I think that's the key metric today is it used to be true that nothing was in a certified or a FIP or something like, or sorry, a fisheries improvement project or an aquaculture improvement project. And now that's unusual to find that. So now it's going to be about, well, what certification actually is more than just environmental? It has some of those other sustainability issues that I mentioned earlier. And how well is the fishery or the farm tracking against those metrics and improving? I mean, I think metrics is here, it's growing, but it's mostly through certification is the way that those metrics happen and get tracked.
Is there anything aspect of it that you can feel lonely in this role?
Yes, because this type of role, your existence is can be just you on your own trying to do things to make a difference on sustainability within your company, but often you can be the only one who does that in the company and the only one who understands that in the company. They don't know why they need you, but they do need you. The CEO, of course, does. But a lot of the sales people or the procurement people, they could be like, why do I have to do that?
Right.
Right. Now, that's not as true as it was when I first started like 8 years ago, but that is a lonely space. However, it's also an appropriately challenging one, right? Because it really forced me to be like, okay, there's no room here for nice to haves. We're only focused on must haves. What are the
Mm.
sustainability must haves that I need them to focus on? Because if they see that I'm being more idealistic than I need to be, then that's going to affect their willingness to engage me on those issues because I'm starting to waste their time on things that don't actually matter today. They might matter tomorrow, and there's a certain amount of allocation for the nice to haves in the future. But we're still in the what are the must haves? What do we need to do on the must haves? I think the greatest lesson for me in this role and taking this on is that I've always believed that if you're not uncomfortable, you're not really getting anywhere. And that is
Mm.
very much how this could feel from time to time
What's
is
what's one bold, uncomfortable step that every CEO listening to this should take this year?
I would say you have to challenge your assumptions on how you do business and how sustainability might affect that. So you have to be open to exploring things that maybe you don't really want to explore, like human rights due diligence. Because I think we're in this space now where when I started, and for the record, like I started more on the NGO side of things, and then I steadily marched to the private sector. And when I started in the NGO space, I felt like the conversations 20 years ago were much more grounded and moderate. We're kind of living in this time of more extreme perspectives. And I think that because of that, you really have to have an answer if somebody comes at you and said, this is what's true in your supply chain. If you don't have a good answer to why it's not true,
Mhm.
that's an uncomfortable space for you and will probably be a costly one for
All
you.
right, one last thing. Finish this sentence. The companies that will win in the future are the ones that.
Answers and data that track compliance and improvement on every single sustainability issue that matters. And it's okay if those are in different places. Some will be very simple, some will be very complicated, and that's okay.
Love it.